Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us today for a discussion with Zbigniew Bzak, a photojournalist with the Chicago Tribune. We are celebrating an exhibit at the Peggy Notebaert Nature Museum, Without a Trace, that showcases a series of Zbigniew's aerial photographs taken in March 2020 during the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic in the United States. Today we are joined by Zbigniew, and we are going to hear more about his practice as a photographer and what inspired this series. Zbigniew, thank you for joining us today. We're thrilled to be sharing a digital preview of your work in Without a Trace. So tell us a little bit about your work as a photojournalist. When did you know you wanted to work with photography as a medium, and what led you to this profession?
I was pretty much a compulsive picture taker as a young person. I grew up in Poland, and I photographed my family, I photographed my friends in high school, I photographed my colleagues at the university. It wasn't really, didn't have much of an agenda of, I just love taking pictures. And it gave me it gave me a lot of pleasure, basically. I was doing this for the whole time. Photojournalism at the time in Poland, which was a communist country, was not much of a profession, or there was no outlet for that. So to practice photojournalism up there, you would have to go through a censorship, you would have to, there was really no outlet. So I'd say I was a photojournalist even then, but I wasn't practicing photojournalism. So that was kind of a problem, and I found the photojournalist much later. But in the meantime, I went traveling. I spent a few years in South America and Mexico, traveling on expeditions with a whitewater kayaking, also taking pictures for publications. But much more consciously, when I got into photography, was when I started working for the newspapers, because by then I had a lot of experience in picture taking and the publishing. But I discovered the photojournalism, the sort of two things. One is recording the events, recording what is happening around me. And secondly, much more important, was I found that photojournalism is great for storytelling. That you find the subjects, you find the situations, and you can explore that, and you can produce a body of work which will have a narrative. It's going to have a story. And the newspaper like Chicago Tribune, and not just newspaper, but the whole organization, was very supportive and is supportive of this kind of work. So, it was a perfect match. About 18 years ago, I joined the staff, and really gave me the forum for publishing, and it gave me opportunity to work on the big projects as well.
What are some of the projects that you worked on that you would consider the most significant in relation to your artistic practice?
I think, for me, the latest projects I'm working on is always the most important, because I got really engaged and I put everything in it. So that's always what I want to talk about it. But actually, for Tribune, I cover a variety of subjects, variety of places, topics, almost everything. Probably the most important, I would say, would be like, covering a campaign. Like I spent 1 year on the campaign trail with Barack Obama for the first 2008. Spent some time in the White House. Those are very memorable and, very also learning experiences for me. I was kind of inside all this big political machine and could see how it works. And in relation to, of course, to media, I was representing the Chicago Tribune at the time, and that was very well established relationship with the media. So otherwise, I think my specialty, kind of, at the Tribune was disasters. And man-made disasters like war and conflict areas. I've done some of that too. But I was doing a lot of nature disasters, like hurricane. My first assignment, I was sent into hurricane right before it hit it in Louisiana, and actually stayed throughout the whole thing, seeing the whole thing as it developed in Lafayette, Louisiana. Then I covered Katrina, aftermath of Katrina at least, and some other disasters, and countless tornadoes. Probably the biggest destruction I saw and covered firsthand. I got there like a couple of hours after it hit. Was town of Washington. It's close to Peoria in Illinois, which was EF5, I think, and that was a disaster. That just came through, smacked through downtown, not downtown, it's like a sprawl, cut 10 miles and probably 2-mile path of nothing left, just a floorboards from the houses. That's all you could see. And basically, both of those places, New Orleans and Washington, I was able to get a lot of aerial pictures because at the time I had a helicopter flight over New Orleans, very short but pretty productive. But in Washington, I found a pilot who just loved to fly, and he flew me for like about 2 hours. And the chronicle, the whole area, pretty much seeing the full extent of the path, and you know, that was just pretty amazing experience for me, just to be there in the morning, spend all night at that place, and then next morning I was able to see it from the air.
It's interesting that you talk about disasters in that way. Without a Trace, the exhibit here at the Peggy Nottebohm Nature Museum is a selection of aerial photographs of the city of Chicago during the first weeks of the COVID-19 crisis. It almost feels sometimes that there's nothing that happens as destructive, but it feels like one of those scenes of destructions that you talk about. What inspired you to create this series, and why was it so important in that moment to capture those scenes?
The shelter-in-place orders came pretty suddenly. You know, the whole pandemic developed so fast that suddenly we had shelter in place, but we didn't really know what's going to be. You know, how that's going to look or how that's going to translate it. I talked to my editor, Todd Panagopoulos, and he says, well, let's just go and fly. There's no people in the streets. So I came downtown, and flying a drone, one of the sort of the biggest obstacles are the people. We cannot fly over people. And there are some places in Chicago that are always busy. There's always someone there, and you know, it's really limiting. So first it was like, let's use an opportunity to get some great aerial pictures. And so I spent like the morning into afternoon just basically going some of the well-known places. And of course, the more time I spend in the air, especially then looking at my pictures on the screen, I realized that there is some odd thing going on. I've seen those kind of things. I've seen places like that. I did see disasters. I see the war zones. And this place suddenly looked like something unreal. I couldn't, you know, I didn't understand exactly what was going on, but it just looked different because it was voided of people, voided of any action, but there was no destruction. There was no signs of any kind of, you know, invasion or anything like that, but it looked like that, it felt like that. So we decided to continue that, said like, covered Millennium Park, Michigan Avenue, some of the downtown portions, river. Went to the neighborhoods, and it's very similar situation. Well recognizable neighborhoods suddenly voided of people, no traffic, or very little. And that was the kind of a revelation which at the time I didn't quite understood, and it kind of got to me a little bit later. This was also, I produced a video, a video about the same subject, and it was really interesting to see that.
So let's talk about the use of the drone. You said you were taking pictures ever since you were young, and the technology for photography has changed so much. You also talked about your first aerial shots being taken from a helicopter. So we see this technology growing in importance in photography. What are some of the advantages in changing the tools of photography, and how have they impacted your work over time?
Well, I did a lot of aerial photography in the past, and some of it was in South America, in Peru mostly, flying a big helicopters over like the deepest canyon in the world, flying over high ridges on the mountains up to like 20,000 feet. So it was always, I'd always enjoyed that process because you had a huge helicopter. Actually, those were military helicopters. So we had, it's a lot of preparations, but a very small window of opportunity, because once you get up, you had to do it, no matter what. And flying over Chicago, I did several flights, almost few flights a year with a small helicopter, and we did use that extensively for any of the aerial shots. And I was doing some of them, most of the stuff people can do it, but I love to do that. So I was flying over my favorite areas usually. But it's also very limiting, because you have to get the helicopter, you have to take off, and it's noisy, it's very invasive, so you can't go and fly over some areas, because you're going to disturb that scene. So with drones, which came much more came to use in much wider scale, the advantage of the technology is that just like going work with the camera, I choose the time, I choose the opportunity. I can stay for a couple of hours, wait until the situation is right, the light is right, and I go and fly. And it's extremely quiet, doesn't announce itself, and has a big flexibility. So I think that this is not a solution, this is just an addition to what you do. And there is a certain subjects which I also photograph a lot, which a drone is a perfect match, because if you're flying over a lake shore to see erosion of the lake, that's the way to see it. There is a way that you would never see it from the shore. You never see it from another way than looking directly down or looking at the angle at the shore. So it becomes more useful, and for certain stories it becomes actually a critical piece of equipment. It's the way to see it, something that you wouldn't be able to project otherwise.
Nature photography is a significant part of your practice. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience of photographing nature specifically, and what is the most exciting part of the process for you?
Well, I think nature photography has some expectations. Actually, I do not consider myself a nature photographer. Actually, I photograph an environment, and that's what interests me the most. And the environment, it's not just the pure nature, but I like the intersection of the nature, the industrial, the edges of the wilderness. we have industrial, post-industrial areas, especially around here. It's extremely, there's plenty of that. And I just love to photograph. When I was flying helicopters, I always go over Calumet River to see the post-industrial, some reclamation projects, still a lot of industry, and there is nature, there's wetlands there. So you have all three elements in just one large but pretty manageable area. So that's pretty much what I put myself as more for photographing environment, and that leads to the stories I want to talk about. That we the Chicago Tribune started working on a Great Lake projects. It's really stories about climate change and the consequences of that, of people who reside on the Great Lakes, but also about the greater ecosystem of the Great Lakes. And some of the stories are really science or data driven, and the photography is used to sort of put face into, to tell the story about people who are affected by that, who lived all their life and see, eyewitness some of the changes. They may not have a knowledge about why or even great interest, but they know why because they live there. They have a much greater knowledge sometimes than people who are research. They can put the numbers, but they lived through their own experiences. So we are on the fourth lake right now, and those are published as a series of photographs. And I use extensively drone because it's also the aerial shots are very important to tell this kind of story.
One of the things that you touch on with the story of the Great Lakes is that the story is important for the people who live there because they live there. They don't know why, but they know it's important. There's a similar idea in Without a Trace. The image is all distinctive from Chicago. It's Chinatown, it's Division Street through Amble Park, it's the L crossing the river. But you have to know Chicago and you have to know what's missing. Which leads to the question, how did you choose these specific locations for this series?
This was interesting because the first day when actually I was just enjoying the emptiness to accommodate my flying, was pretty natural. Good river, a Millennium Park, which is of course odd because I never seen anything like that, because I can see that from the windows of our office, some of it. But so that was kind of natural going through. I had no list, I had no really plan, and just go to the places which tell Chicago or somewhat recognizable, like State Street. And then the day after I said, well, I can't just going back to the same places. Let's go to neighborhoods. So I was trying to find, yes, the neighborhoods, if you go, it's somewhat for people who live here, but they know some of the areas, or at least they've seen it on the photographs. But when you go to places like a Chinatown, and you have a very recognizable landmarks, I didn't want to do the landmarks itself, but they are recognizable landmarks, or a Puerto Rican neighborhood which has very distinct and landmark. So I went to different neighborhoods, Pilsen, I went to Bronzeville, several different places, trying to look for something which makes them distinct. To me they are, because I know them all. I spend so much time driving around all the time. But then choosing the pictures, I was looking like, anybody knows what this place really is? But I think people do. I think that even if they're not really sure exactly where, they probably never seen those kind of empty scenes during the daytime.
And that's interesting too, because to me, that's part of why this series was so important in terms of creating that connection between what happened and what is still happening, and people through the images. You're presenting to them a visual of something that they feel like their own, that they live in these places and draw an emotional connection with. They see these places and they know there's something off.
I think people from the neighborhood, they know that too. But I was surprised that some neighborhoods were still pretty vibrant, even shelter in place, no traffic. I went to some other places which was really difficult to fly because it was there was still people around. I just, I put back a premise of that. I want to had to be legal to start it, but secondly, that actually illustrates the story.
It's interesting when we think about the name of the exhibit as well, Without a Trace. I think when we were looking at the photos, the first thing that came to mind was that there was no trace of people, but it's also related to the destruction we were talking about. You see that there was something disruptive, but there is no sign of physical disruption. But it's also related to the illness of COVID-19. You see no evidence of it, but you can detect its presence by the absence of people in the street. So I think the name becomes this double meaning.
In some ways, New Orleans looks somewhat, this was basically not a hurricane, that was the flood. So I was basically going on the boat or waiting in some of the streets. But when you get in a helicopter, you actually see the whole neighborhood. There is no really there were some fires, but there is no like mass distractions like a tornado. The whole town is leveled, floorboards on the ground. You see that distraction. In New Orleans, there were water. And it's actually looks pretty interesting because there is a water on between the houses, but the houses were intact too. So some of the disasters have a whole different look to them. And I start thinking about one, when we had conversations, that this one has a parallel, looks similar, even. I can't has the feeling of a disaster, even if it's not a disaster to any of the physical properties, but just devoid of humans, something which, make our city alive. That's what makes our city the city we like.
It's true. I think it's part of the reason why it's hard for people to connect the idea of destruction with something that they cannot see as visually destructive. As humans, we need visuals to process our emotions and make sense of reality. So your work then becomes a way to remind us that this period of time was very destructive for us.
Yeah, I think that's the more I think, I get more psyched about that, actually, because as a photographer, especially working as a journalist, well, this is a probably lifetime sort of event you're witnessing, and everybody was trying to figure out maybe less or more deliberate way of showing that. So it's kind of interesting because some of my friends did a series of portraits at home, and everybody has a different take on it. So this is one of those which the photography and the storytelling possibility, because you can interpret anywhere you want later on, but those pictures are sort of a witness of the time, witness of that span of time, which especially then we had no idea what's going to happen. I think that's my small contribution to the big dialogue, that if 100 years from now, somebody would look at pandemic from this era, they may look at whole different materials, and I'm sure there was plenty of record and documents, visual documents. This is my little contribution, and as always, something which just kind of came organically. I did not wake up and plan of the big coverage for the pandemic. I just started doing what I like to do, what I know how to do it, and I was glad that some people are making possible to wider audience to see them. So I'm really glad how everything worked out.
I love how we have come full circle from your photography as a kid and trying to tell a story to today where you're still trying to tell a story through photography. We are very appreciative as well that we are able to share your work with a wider audience. And thank you, Zbigniew, for your enthusiasm with Without a Trace and for your time today to speak to me. Thank you once again for joining us for this conversation with Chicago Tribune photojournalist Zbigniew Bzak. Be sure to leave any questions you have below, and don't forget to subscribe to the Nature Museum's channel. Without a Trace will be on display at the Peggy Notteboer Nature Museum when our building reopens, and we do hope to see you then.